Imagine hearing your mother's voice calling from the bedroom, asking you to come see something special. Except your mother is 3,000 miles away. And as you watch in horror, the doorknob slowly twists back and forth while that familiar voice grows more impatient, calling your name over and over from behind the closed door. This happened to 11-year-old Michael Johnson on Elm Street. By the end of this story, you'll understand why an entire building had to be demolished to stop what was living inside. You know how sometimes you walk into a place and your skin just crawls, like every instinct in your body is screaming at you to turn around and leave, but you can't quite put your finger on why because nothing looks obviously wrong on the surface. Yet something deep in your gut tells you that this place has seen things, terrible things that have left invisible scars in the air itself. That's exactly what happened to the Johnson family back in 2001 when they signed the lease on apartment 4B on Elm Street, a crumbling 4-story building in the kind of neighborhood where streetlights flicker like dying candles and the sound of sirens becomes as familiar as your own heartbeat, where broken glass sparkles on sidewalks like deadly confetti and every shadow seems to hide something you don't want to meet. Michael Johnson was 11 years old then, that perfect age where you're still young enough to believe in monsters, but old enough to know when something isn't right. And from the moment his family stepped through that warped wooden door with its peeling paint and rusted hinges, he felt like they had walked into the belly of some sleeping beast that might wake up at any moment and swallow them whole. The apartment itself seemed to exhale decades of misery through its yellowed wallpaper that curled at the edges like fingers trying to peel away from something underneath. And there was this smell that clung to everything, a mixture of stale cigarettes and something else, something sweet and rotten like fruit left too long in the sun, a smell that seemed to seep from the very bones of the building and coat the inside of your throat when you breathed. The layout was simple but somehow wrong, with a narrow hallway that stretched from the front door to the back bedrooms like a throat designed to swallow light, leaving the far end always shrouded in shadows no matter how many lamps they turned on. And Michael noticed that sounds carried strangely through that corridor, echoing and distorting until you could never be sure if what you heard was real or just your imagination playing tricks on you. At first, the strange things were subtle enough that the family could almost convince themselves they were imagining it all, just the normal settling sounds of an old building adjusting to new occupants. But Sarah Johnson, Michael's mother, would lie awake at night with her hand pressed against her husband David's chest, feeling his steady heartbeat while she listened to something that sounded exactly like footsteps pacing back and forth across the ceiling above their heads, slow and deliberate. Steps that would start at the stroke of midnight and continue for hours, even though she knew perfectly well that there was no apartment above theirs, just the roof and the empty sky beyond. Those midnight footsteps became as regular as clockwork, and Sarah would count them sometimes, 100 steps from the front of the building to the back, then 100 steps back again, over and over until she would finally drift off to sleep around 3 in the morning, only to wake up tired and on edge, as if she had spent the night running instead of resting. But it was 8-year-old Tommy, Michael's little brother, who became the first real victim of whatever lived in that apartment, and his ordeal began with nightmares so vivid and terrifying that his screams would tear through the building like sirens, jolting the entire family awake at exactly 3 a.m. every single night with the kind of raw, primal terror that makes your blood freeze in your veins and your heart forget how to beat properly. Night after night, they would find Tommy running through that narrow hallway like his life depended on it, his bare feet slapping against the cold linoleum with a sound like applause while he screamed words that no 8-year-old should ever have to scream, his voice cracking with panic as he threw himself into his mother's arms, his small body shaking so violently that Sarah worried he might actually vibrate apart like a tuning fork struck too hard. The strangest part wasn't just Tommy's terror, though that was heartbreaking enough to watch, but the way his skin would be ice cold to the touch even on the hottest summer nights, as if whatever he had seen or experienced had literally frozen the warmth right out of his little body, and he would whisper the most chilling words while pointing toward the living room door with a trembling finger, telling his parents about the things that sat there in the darkness, watching and waiting, things that wanted to hurt him in ways his young mind couldn't even begin to understand. Sarah would hold her youngest son and follow his terrified gaze toward the living room, seeing nothing but the familiar shapes of their furniture cast in shadow, but feeling something else entirely, a presence that seemed to press against her consciousness like fingers probing for a way inside. And she began to understand that Tommy wasn't having nightmares at all, but was seeing something that the rest of them were somehow blind to. Something that visited him every night at 3 a.m. with malicious intent. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night when the family woke up not to Tommy's screams, but to an even more disturbing silence. And they found him sitting perfectly still in the corner of the living room, not crying or calling out for help, just sitting there in the complete darkness with his eyes wide open and fixed on something none of them could see. His face wearing an expression of such profound emptiness that it looked like whatever made Tommy himself had been carefully scooped out and replaced with something else entirely. Around the same time, 9-year-old Emma began experiencing her own supernatural encounters, though hers took the form of sleepwalking episodes that turned their home into a nightly haunted house show. And Michael would wake up to the sound of shuffling footsteps in the hallway, only to peer out of his room and see what looked like a ghost drifting through their apartment. A moving blanket that seemed to float through the narrow corridor with impossible grace and purpose. Under that blanket was Emma, her hair wrapped in the silk scarf she wore to bed, walking with her eyes closed toward destinations that existed only in whatever world she was visiting during these midnight journeys. And there was something deeply unsettling about watching his sister navigate their home with perfect confidence while completely unconscious, as if she was being guided by hands that belonged to someone else, someone who knew their apartment layout better than they did. These sleepwalking episodes weren't random wandering either, but seemed to follow specific routes that made no logical sense, taking Emma to places like the kitchen, where she would stand motionless in front of the refrigerator for 20 minutes before moving on, or to the bathroom, where she would face the mirror without opening her eyes, her lips sometimes moving as if she was having a conversation with her own reflection, or with something standing behind it that only she could perceive. But all of these experiences, as disturbing as they were, paled in comparison to what happened during the summer of 2004, when the family had saved enough money for a vacation back to their homeland, leaving only David and Michael behind in apartment 4B, while David worked overtime to pay for the trip and earn a little extra money that might eventually get them out of that cursed place for good. So there was 11-year-old Michael, alone in that haunted apartment from sunrise to late afternoon, with nothing but daytime television and his own racing imagination for company, while his father spent long hours at the engineering firm downtown, completely unaware that he was leaving his son to face whatever lived in that building without any protection or witnesses to what was about to unfold. It was a Tuesday in July, one of those brutally hot summer days when the air itself feels thick enough to swim through, and the apartment had become like a tomb, trapping heat and something else, something that seemed to press against Michael's skin like invisible hands, making him feel claustrophobic and watched even though he knew he was completely alone in the building. Or at least he thought he was alone until noon arrived and changed everything. Michael was sitting in the living room watching some mindless game show, letting the host's cheerful voice fill the oppressive silence while he tried not to think about how the shadows in that narrow hallway seemed to move and shift even when no one was walking through them. When he heard something that made his blood turn to ice water in his veins, a sound that shouldn't have been possible but was unmistakably real. A woman's voice was calling from his parents' bedroom at the end of the hall, and not just any woman's voice, but one he recognized instantly with the kind of bone-deep familiarity that comes from hearing it every day of your life. The voice that had sung him lullabies and called him to dinner and told him bedtime stories. His mother's voice speaking to him from a room that should have been empty, calling his name with the exact same loving inflection she always used when she wanted to show him something special. At first, Michael tried to convince himself it was just the neighbor's television bleeding through the thin walls, or maybe his own imagination playing cruel tricks on him after spending too many hours alone in that oppressive atmosphere. So he turned down the volume on his own TV and listened carefully, hoping to hear nothing but the normal sounds of an empty apartment settling in the summer heat. But the voice came again, clearer and more distinct this time, calling his name with such perfect maternal warmth that for a split second, he almost forgot that his mother was thousands of miles away, and he found himself actually considering the impossible possibility that she had somehow come home early to surprise him, until logic reasserted itself and reminded him that she couldn't possibly be in that room, which meant something else was using her voice to call him. Michael's hand trembled as he reached for the remote and clicked off the television, plunging the apartment into the kind of heavy silence that seems to have weight and substance, the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every small sound, from the hum of the refrigerator to the creaking of old wooden bones settling in their joints, and most terrifyingly, the sound of his own rapid breathing and hammering heartbeat. Standing at the mouth of that dark hallway and staring toward his parents' closed bedroom door, Michael felt like he was looking down the barrel of a gun, and when his mother's voice came again, so perfectly reproduced that it included every familiar nuance and loving tone, asking him to come to the bedroom because she had something wonderful to show him, he watched in absolute terror as the doorknob began to twist slowly from side to side, as if someone on the other side was testing to see if it was locked. The rational part of Michael's mind knew with absolute certainty that his mother was on a different continent, probably sleeping peacefully in her childhood bed while he stood frozen with fear in their haunted apartment. But the voice was so perfectly convincing, so exactly right in every detail, that some primitive part of his brain kept insisting that maybe, just maybe, she really was there, really was calling to him with love and excitement about some surprise she couldn't wait to share. But when that doorknob continued its slow, deliberate movement and his mother's voice called again, now with just the slightest edge of impatience creeping in, the same tone she used when she was waiting for him to come help with something important, Michael's survival instincts finally overrode everything else and sent him running through that apartment like his life depended on getting as far away as possible from whatever was impersonating his mother behind that bedroom door. He ran past the kitchen and through the front door, not bothering to lock it behind him, and down 4 flights of stairs without stopping, his feet barely touching the steps as he fled from the building like it was on fire. And he didn't stop running until he reached the entrance to the building, where he collapsed on the front steps, gasping and shaking while the summer heat pressed down on him like a blanket. But even the oppressive humidity felt refreshing compared to the suffocating atmosphere inside apartment 4B. Michael spent the rest of that day sitting on those concrete steps, watching the street and jumping at every sound, too terrified to go back inside, but too embarrassed to call his father and try to explain what had happened. Because how do you tell a rational, practical man that something in your apartment was using your mother's voice to try to lure you into an empty room, especially when you know he'll just assume you've been watching too many horror movies and letting your imagination run wild? When David Johnson finally came home from work that evening and found his son sitting outside looking like he'd seen a ghost, which in many ways he had, Michael tried to explain what had happened, stumbling over the words and watching his father's expression shift from concern to skepticism to barely concealed irritation, because David was the kind of engineer who believed in facts and evidence and logical explanations, not ghost stories told by 11-year-old boys with overactive imaginations. David listened to his son's story with the patient expression of a man humoring a child, making all the appropriate concerned father noises while clearly not believing a single word. And when Michael finished his breathless account of hearing his mother's voice and seeing the doorknob move, David just shook his head and suggested that maybe Michael had been spending too much time alone and watching too much television, letting his fears get the better of him in an old building that was full of strange sounds and shadows. But the universe has a way of teaching lessons to skeptics. And the next summer, when the family went on vacation and left David alone in apartment 4B to work and save money, he discovered firsthand that his son hadn't been making up stories or letting his imagination run wild, but had been trying to warn him about something genuinely dangerous that lived in that building and fed on human fear and misery. David lasted exactly 3 days alone in that apartment before something happened that shattered his rational worldview so completely that he called his family on the 4th day with a voice they barely recognized. A voice that shook with the kind of terror that comes from having everything you thought you knew about reality torn apart and rebuilt in a much darker and more frightening configuration. The man who had dismissed his son's story as childish nonsense was now telling his wife to pack everything they owned because they were moving immediately, not next month or next year, but right now. And there was something in his voice that made it clear he wasn't open to discussion or negotiation, that whatever had happened to him in that apartment had convinced him beyond any shadow of doubt that they needed to get out before it was too late. Within a month, the Johnson family had found a new apartment in a different neighborhood, packed all their belongings, and said goodbye to Elm Street forever, never speaking about what they had experienced there and never looking back, as if they were afraid that even acknowledging the place might somehow give it power over them again, or create some kind of psychic connection that would allow whatever lived there to follow them to their new home. 2 years later, the entire building on Elm Street was demolished by the city, officially due to structural damage and foundation problems that made it unsafe for human habitation. But Michael couldn't help wondering if the real reason had more to do with the number of families who had moved out suddenly and unexpectedly, or the reports of strange sounds and unexplained phenomena that had accumulated over the decades, or maybe even complaints from neighbors about screaming that echoed from empty apartments at 3 in the morning. The Johnson family never spoke about their time on Elm Street again, treating it like a shared nightmare that they could make disappear by refusing to acknowledge it. But some experiences leave marks that go deeper than memory, and even now, decades later, Michael still wakes up sometimes at exactly 3 a.m. with his heart pounding and his ears straining to hear footsteps that aren't there, listening for voices calling his name from empty rooms, because some places leave their fingerprints on your soul, an apartment. For Beyond Elm Street was one of those places that remembers everyone who ever lived there and makes sure they remember it too. If you enjoyed this story, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Share your own paranormal experiences in the comments below, if you dare.